Does Matt know that too?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They said something about
Okay, everyone. Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome to our third, I think this is, speaker for our Master Teacher Initiative 20th year celebration speaker series. And as many of you know, the MTI has been around for, well, 20 years. It was the brainchild of Doug Hoffman from the College of Business and Mike Palmquist, who was the founding director of TILT. Apparently Doug kind of got it going, and it was keenly interested in how to sort of rejuvenate or inject interest in teaching in an R1 institution. And so he really set his sights upon trying to come up with something, came up with the MTI. And then Mike Palmquist, as the founding director of TILT, was happy to be the original sponsor of the MTI. As you know, the MTI positions a particular representative within every college, and those folks send out teaching tips once a week, and then we'll have workshops from time to time. And TILT is just delighted that practice continues today. So we have two more talks after today's. Next week we have Andrew Norton from AG, who will be talking to us about the first 10 or 20 years of the MTI and what those 20 years can tell us about the next 10. And so we're looking forward to that. And then our final talk on May the 1st is Nana Pitt-Limlamai from Department of English, who will be talking to us about new ways and important ways of understanding cultural responses in classrooms and what is really what is meant by identity in classrooms. And so I encourage you to attend both of those. We had James Paul G. a week ago. You may know that he is a world-renowned linguist who speaks into the culture of learning. So we've had some great folks. Pinar Omar Osbeck was prior to James Paul G. last week, and just a great group of people. And it's been our pleasure really to host terrific folks who really are on the cutting edge of teaching and learning, and no less so today. So I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today. Matthew Rhodes is a professor of psychology in the Department of Psychology here at CSU. He earned his PhD in cognitive psychology in 2004 from Florida State University, was a postdoctoral research associate at Washington University in St. Louis, and has been at CSU since 2006. Dr. Rhodes' research focuses on the science of learning, with an emphasis on how individuals understand and control their own learning. He focuses on memory, metacognition, and evidence-based approaches to learning and teaching. He's a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and the American Psychological Association, and serves on the editorial board of several journals in learning and memory, specifically the Journal of Experimental Psychology Applied, Metacognition and Learning, and the Journal of Memory and Language. Dr. Rhodes is currently an associate editor also for the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition, and has won several awards for teaching and mentoring. He teaches the class Evidence-Based Approaches to College Instruction. Dr. Rhodes is also author, along with Cleary and Ed DeLosh, of the book A Guide to Effective Studying and Learning, Practical Strategies from the Science of Learning, 2020, Oxford University Press. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Rhodes.
Sure, thanks so much. This is such a fun group to be with. And by the way, everybody online, are the Teams folks hearing us, no problem?
Yeah.
Okay, so they can chime in if they have any issues. So this is a really fun talk. It's one I like to do. And maybe one way to set the stage, let me go grab this. I can talk as we go, like this thing is frozen right here. So I don't know. The way I often think of this, you'll see this come up in a second. I don't know what everybody else's experiences of teaching were. Oh, this is interesting. There we go. My experience as a grad student, and I'd be curious what yours was I was like essentially told, like, go teach that class.
That was like my second semester. And I remember, I don't know how some of you would have solved this problem. I mean, my first thought was like, what were the classes I liked? And like, can I just imitate the folks who I had seen before? So I sort of was like grasping and trying to figure out what I should do when I first started. And to be honest, again, by the way, by a show of hands, I'd be curious, like, so other people had this experience where you were just thrown in and told to teach? So in some ways, if we take a step back, this is completely nuts. Like, in what other parts of life are you thrown into such an important responsibility where they're essentially like, you'll just figure it out and it's fine? So I've always thought this was strange, but one byproduct as somebody who's into learning of just throwing folks in is, we all come to teaching with our own particular ideas about learning, what's good for learning, our own pet ideas. And some of those are probably going to be well grounded, but some of them might not entirely capture what we might think of as evidence-based approaches to learning. And so in that sort of context, I actually am really into the idea that we shouldn't be throwing people in, we should be giving you some training. I was really fortunate, my 4th year of grad school, I took a teaching course that completely changed everything I thought about teaching. We're actually, Tilt does a lot of this stuff. In the Department of Psychology, we actually do have a teaching course for the grad students called Evidence-Based Approaches to Teaching. And one goal is what it sounds like. We want to have students go into a teaching situation aware of what the literature tells them so they can make best use of those practices. So one thing that happens when we're just throwing folks in is there are all kinds of really sort of strange ideas about learning, and some of them are strange, some of them are intuitive, but learning comes with a number of myths. And so my goal today is really this. I just want to identify a few of the big myths in teaching. And so I don't think it's enough to just say, hey, this idea is out there, it's not evidence-based. My goal today is I'll talk about some of these myths, and then I'll try to talk about, here's the myth, but here's maybe a better practice that you could incorporate into the classroom. And then my goal is not to talk at our audience here and our team's audience. My goal is not to talk at you for 60 minutes and call it a day. So I deliberately, and I'll actually talk later why I'm taking this approach. This is about 30 minutes of content right here. I would love to hear from you. What are your own myths? What are your thoughts on some of these myths we talk about? So I'm happy to chat as we go along. If you want to, you can wait till we're done. But I'm really curious for your own thoughts on this. So I'm claiming that we're going to talk about myths, but what do I actually mean by myths? So here's how I'm going to define it. Ideas about teaching and learning that are widely believed, widely practiced, but that would contradict the research literature. So I'll give you an example to start with. I don't know if you've ever run into this before. So learning styles is a classic one. So this is the myth that students learn best when their style of learning matches the teaching style. So this is pervasive. I'll actually show you a bit of survey data for a second. This is entirely wrong. It is the case that people do express stable preferences about the kind of learning, like I'm a visual or verbal learner, but the catch is those preferences actually have sort of no predictive value for learning. So those preferences don't tell us anything about learning outcomes. So widely believed, like disturbingly widely believed. I'll show you 2 examples of this. I actually don't do that much survey work. This is about all the survey work I've done in my entire career to show you here. So we have a study where among a number of questions about learning, we asked folks, do you believe that students have different learning styles, like the verbal versus like visual learner? This is a group of 147 instructors at CSU. This is actually an undergrad honors student. This was her honors thesis that we ended up publishing. So about 91% endorsed that idea, and the majority of them said they attempted to teach to those styles. In a more recent paper, this is Becky Osborne for her master's thesis. We were really interested in learning and thoughts about learning among veterinary instructors. So in the midst of a wide-ranging survey, we asked the same question. And as you can see there, the vast majority of veterinary instructors endorse the idea of learning styles, and most of them say they are teaching to learning styles. Interesting. I mean, so I don't know, Scott Lilienfeld, the late Scott Lilienfeld was this really interesting clinical psychologist who wrote a lot about science and pseudoscience. So Scott talked about what he referred to as zombie myths. Zombie myths meaning like no matter how many times you try to kill this myth, you just cannot get the myth to go away. Learning styles is a zombie myth. There's about like the last 20 years of cognitive psychologists, educational psychologists saying there's nothing to that. And it's still incredibly pervasive, so pervasive. So I'm honored to be here for Till today. They gave me a really cool sort of spreadsheet or sheet going in on ideas about accessibility to make sure the talk is accessible. Do you know what I'm about to say here? So one of the lines says that as part of my talk, I should be taking into account your learning styles. So again, this is again, like, this is all over. Actually, my colleague, Ann Cleary, has a fantastic recent paper with Dan Robinson, who used to be here, on learning styles as a form of misinformation. If anybody's curious, it's actually a really cool paper working through almost the whole history of learning styles and thinking about it in that way. So this is what I mean by myth. So a belief that's so something that's widely believed, but maybe doesn't match up with the research literature. So I've actually, for this talk, I've tried to identify 4 myths that I think really characterize college teaching. So I'll place right at it. I'll start with this one right here. So one way we might frame it is this. So imagine like you invite a relative to the class you're teaching, class you're taking. What do they think they're going to run into? So I would think if you invited somebody to class, their picture of what's going to be going on in class is somebody in front of the room, like what I'm doing right now. Your picture is going to be somebody in front of the room who's talking at everybody. Oh, I don't think it's that. It's actually blocking out every time. But I'll try this one more time. This one, or I'm a Zoom guy. Let's see if I can do this here. Okay. I mean, I actually know this talk well enough, I can just say it to you. Okay, so I was into like, if you invite somebody to class, what do they think they're going to see? And again, I think they're going to see something like what I'm doing right now. And so although, and there's actually lots of data on this, this is the most common method of teaching in college settings. So although it's the most common, I'm going to make the argument it's not the most effective method. So I'll walk you through some data on that. By the way, I also fully appreciate the irony that I'm basically using a form of lecture to tell you not to only use a form of lecture. Okay, so I just wanted to get that out of the way. I'm fully aware of that. I love this DeLosh paper. This paper's become pretty popular. This is a proceedings paper, proceeding of National Academy of Sciences. So this is a physics class. So everybody gets a physics lesson. All they're going to do is play around. They have 2 different lessons, different sections. They're going to play around with how that lesson is transmitted. Everybody's going to, they're going to get a lesson. Everybody's going to get a final test. And they're also going to ask people, like, how well did you feel you were learning? So here's what they did. So for one of the sections, they took this approach. It was a highly skilled lecture. It's a fluent lecture. They would work through concepts, put up example problems, and the instructor would solve the exact example problems step by step. So for people who know literature, these are worked examples. So basically doing worked examples of math problems. In the active condition, the content and the lecture is identical. The only difference is when the instructor introduces example problems, the students get into small groups and work on those example problems themselves. TA and the instructor circulate the room, talk with them, and then the instructor gets up and gives them the feedback on the problem. So everything's identical. One group is working on problems, one group is watching you solve problems. So let's look at the final learning outcome and what students thought about learning. So I'll give you test performance here on the left. We have our passive and active condition. This is how often they were right. They gave them a multiple choice test, but it was like a 6 alternative multiple choice test. So chance performance would be quite low on this. What they find is that the active group is doing on the order of about 10 points better. What's interesting, and I'll try to talk some more about this later, is by the way, which lesson do you think students liked more? The one where they got to watch somebody solve problems, or one where they were made to solve problems? What do you think? Like the passive. And this is something I'll get into. But I'm a really big believer, although there isn't as much evidence for this, I'm now giving you a little more of my opinion, that we have dialogue with students, we tell students about why we're making the choices we're making. But yeah, so this is something you'll run into. So in other words, what was better for the students was actually not necessarily what they regarded as better. But for our purpose, students, think about it, there was nothing different between these lessons. All they did was let's have one group of them solve it on their own. So things we can do to get students involved in active learning will result in better learning outcomes. And I want to be clear too, I actually, from talking with lots of instructors about this, I think on its face, this can be somewhat threatening in the sense that you're like, I don't know, I've worked really hard over the years to pull together a set of lectures, and now you're telling me like I need to ditch I'm not telling you that. So there are still times where you actually do need to get up in front of the students and explain some concepts. So it's okay, you don't have to get rid of everything. My argument is you should be supplementing and augmenting your lecture with other activities, and so lecture isn't the only way you're approaching students. I'll give you a few. I have a special one in there I'll come up with in a second. I'll give you a few. One I love, I bet a lot of you do, I love doing parent shares. So we've talked in class about concepts. I frequently like to get students in pairs. I have one of my students in class, I'm trying to smile at him right now. But I'll get students in pairs and be like, okay, here's what I want you to do. We've gone through like these two theories. How about person A, like what's the theory? What's the evidence for the theory? What are the criticisms? Other person listen, give feedback, and then switch roles. The other person now presents the alternative theory, the evidence, the criticism, the other person listen. While that's happening, the TAs and I walk the room and we talk with students. Again, I could have just as easily gotten up in front of them and told them these theories again. It's going to be a better use of time to have them generate the theories and talk with each other. I love group discussions. One of my favorite, again, I sort of teach, I try to integrate science of learning into class, and I do the science of learning course sometimes. So one thing I like to do is we've talked about these practices. I'll put students in groups and be like, if I made you czar of CSU, so you could mandate anything, what would you do at the university based on the concepts we've talked about to promote better learning outcomes among students? So it makes for a fun group discussion. There's a lot of evidence. Mini quizzes, and I'll get into quizzing later, practice problems, those are all excellent ways to have students be more active. I'll give you another one. I don't know if you've ever heard of exit tickets. So this is a classic one. At the end of the day, before class leaves, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, write down what the key concepts were. I'm actually going to challenge that a little. The most common way people do exit tickets is give me a few minutes on what we worked on today. A better use, and I'll make that case soon, is give me 5 minutes on the concept we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago. So doing it that way. I'll give you another one. I don't know how many of you know Mary. I know Sue does, because they actually did this really cool work. So I don't know if you know, so Sue and Mary did really cool work on integrating writing into the calculus curriculum. So Mary would even do stuff, she showed us this once, like she'd basically show a line and say, how would you describe this function? Tell me about this function. Here's something else. So Mary, for students are pretty freaked out by calculus. And so Mary was running this version where she told me she was in a classroom with a bunch of whiteboards, and they would do stations. So she has a group of TAs, each station, so she would subdivide the students into like groups of 5 or 6. Each station represented a different concept or a different problem. Students would work at a station for 10 or 15 minutes, a buzzer would go off, and then everybody would move to the next station. So again, she just as easily could have just gotten in front of the class and said, here are the 5 things we're going to talk about today. But she wants students actively generating, moving, and so that's how she would teach calculus. I always thought that was like one of the coolest versions of, you don't always have to lecture, we can have students do things and be active in their learning. So this is our starting point, that lecture, again, I'm not arguing you need to get rid of your lecture, but I am saying in terms of efficiency, use of your time, it'll benefit students to integrate activities in class and not just have it be a lecture sort of centered class. Okay, that's our first one. I'll give you the second. This one, like, by the way, for every single one of these myths I'm giving you, I have to be honest, I was just straight lecturing. And the second one, I don't know how you feel. I feel like class a lot of times, I'm almost, I don't know if you have this, like you're racing time. So let me give you an example. Like you're teaching a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. It's Monday, like you're talking with the students, somebody brings up a good point and the students are getting into it and talking about it. But in your head, you're like, if I let this go on too long, I'm not going to be able to cover that. And this, I already wrote the exam's ready to go. So, but that doesn't, I don't know. But then that seemed kind of wrong where I'm like, the students are getting into it. But in my head, I'm so worried about the content I have to cover that I feel like at some point I'm going to have to step in and be like, we have to move on. And so there's this, I'll show you the paper, but I want to start by framing this way. What is our goal in the classroom? Is our goal that I have to tell you everything about our area? Or is our goal that I want effective learning of the important stuff? And the argument I want to make is those are not compatible goals. And that I have to say, I'm going to speak to myself as an instructor, I was way too interested in content coverage at the expense of effective learning. So the paper that got me going, for folks in college and natural sciences, Paul Leyburn does like our newsletter. Paul actually put out a really good one on this. This paper got in my head when I saw, like I read this paper once a year. This is from the journal Life Sciences Education. So these are biology instructors. And if you read it, they're really talking about how should you approach like second year or second semester biology. Here's their argument. Effective teaching is not the same thing as delivering content. Those are not compatible goals. So I'll put another, I'll work through it. One of my former students, Hannah Hausman, so this is something I told, when I go watch class, so I do a fair number of observations, probably one of the most significant actionable things I see is we're all trying to jam too much stuff into a single class session. And Hannah, my former student, is like, if your class is wall-to-wall content, all you're doing is just calling out the stuff that they just need to go learn on their own. They're probably not engaging in any learning in that case. So here's their argument. Once you, and again, this is really sort of transformative. Once you tell yourself, my goal as the instructor is not that I have to tell them everything, but my goal is I want them to learn the important stuff well. It's actually very freeing. It becomes easy to get rid of content. It starts to recenter your class. So this is their argument. Start with the goal that there's no way, like I could tell you everything. You're not going to learn everything. So don't start with the goal they have to hear everything. Start with the goal that I want effective student learning. And once that is your central pivot point for the class, it changes a lot of things. So your next step, and if you read this paper, it's really interesting. They go through an example. So their argument is you should almost, they're doing biology. They're saying maybe you have a theme, like we're going to talk about evolution in a lot of contexts. That theme, the class then begins centering around that theme throughout. So you should identify what's most important, and the class will revolve around that, not trying to tell them everything. And then your job will then be, we just talked about it, like we're going to engage active learning in class. I'm a big believer in talking with students about what effective learning looks like and implementing that throughout the course. I don't know, I'd be curious what thoughts are on this. There's a friend of mine who's actually the staff psychologist at a vet school who I go in there and talk with the students and the faculty about learning there. So I gave a version of this to the vet school. And when I said this, I had almost everybody in the room raise their hands. And so one of the instructors, who I actually become friends with and now co-authored a paper with, but he was like, okay, here's my problem. I have to, like, I'm teaching this class and my job, he teaches pathologic disease. I have to go over 450 diseases in a semester. And so my answer to him was, okay, but are all these diseases equally important? And he was like, no, in fact, there's a bunch of diseases in a typical veterinary practice you would, unless you were hanging out in the tropics or something, you would never encounter these diseases. There, it's interesting. I don't know how many they were like, honestly, and I don't actually like to make these talks just complete sunshine. He was like, we're all scared of the NAVLE. I don't know if you know, the NAVLE is their licensing exam. So it's really weird. There's this tail wagging dog thing going on where the NAVLE is known for putting obscure diseases in front of the students. And so they feel like they have to cover obscure diseases to make sure they can get to the NAVLE, even though they realize it's actually not that important and the students would be fine never learning about it. So I understand if you're under those kind of constraints, but beyond that, my thing to you is let your class breathe be less concerned. It doesn't benefit the students to hear every topic. As Hannah says, if you're just going to jam class with every topic, all you're doing is encouraging it, write down all the concepts, and then I'll do my actual work later. That's all you're doing is sort of labeling the concepts. So this one has gotten in my head, and I'll try to talk in a second. I've tried to actually take these lessons to heart and draw content from the class and drop stuff. So I'll talk about how I've done it. So here's my third myth for you. So I'm interested in the idea that I actually run into a lot of people who are putting a great deal of time into planning their class sessions, but are not putting the same amount of time into thinking about the structure of their course and what students are doing outside of class session. By the way, sorry, I did a Google image search for learning outside of class. It gave me a literal, I just thought it was a cute picture right here. So sorry, I know that looks like a little bizarre. So let me walk through what I mean by this right here. So clearly, I'm going to argue class time is important, but I'm also going to argue that a great deal, maybe most of their learning, is actually occurring essentially outside of class. If you buy into any version of that premise, then we should be just as cognizant, just as detailed, thinking just as much about how we're setting up the structure of the course as we are what we're doing in class. In fact, the TILT framework, actually TILT has an excellent teaching effectiveness framework. I'd be curious what your own department does. If it's okay, I'll say that my criticism of some teaching evaluations is, I don't know, if a lot of them end up being like public speaking evaluations, and in some ways, like, I don't actually care, it doesn't matter. You don't, like, there's actually no evidence you have to be a dynamic public speaker to have good learning. So why are we talking about, like, what we should be doing as part of the evaluation is give me your syllabus, can I have access to your site, tell me how you're approaching it. Like, we should be more into the structure of the course, not did you seem like a dynamic speaker the one day I showed up and watched your class. So let me lay this out for you. So I do think, by the way, we got better about this. The pandemic essentially, I don't know what your experience was. The original pandemic stuff was like, I don't know, I'm teaching this course in person. I'll just load all that stuff up online and make the course run that way. A lot of that doesn't turn out to be very effective. So I do think people started giving a lot more thought to structure in the pandemic, and there is some evidence that people shifted. So here's my argument. But I have a couple, but one of my core teaching philosophies is my job is to create the learning environment. So I want to create the optimal learning environment for the student. I can't go home with them every night and make them learn or anything like that, but my job is to set the environment for them. So we should be creating learning environments that nudge students to do what's best for learning. So I'll give you some examples, and then I'm going to dive deep on this one right here with a couple practices. So we should be thinking about how we promote active learning outside of class. I will talk about that in a second. I'm a big believer, and actually, if you talk with anybody, it's interesting, if you assign papers, and I've done this before, I don't know how often you're like, there's this huge paper, it's just due at the end of the course, you just need to give me the paper. If you talk with people who teach writing, I don't run into anybody who teaches writing who takes that approach. I don't know if that's been, so they break the paper into components, like let's think about what your topic is, and can you give me an outline? So this would be an example of how are you structuring these big assignments. If there's a big assignment, are you breaking them up? Students do much better in those. How much are you distributing practice? I'll get into that in a second. A classic way we teach is we do intensive work. Like today, if you think about the disease, we're going to talk about these, I don't know, they had 450, I guess, per class. They're like, here are the 25 diseases we're going to do today. And then we move on. That's actually not particularly effective for learning. It's not effective for learning to do, we're going to do intense practice and then never touch that again. We should be distributing learning. So I'll walk you through a couple principles. So again, I'm claiming this stuff about structure and you should do stuff with your class. So what principles would guide you? I'm going to push 2 principles. One, should really be thinking about organization and how topics flow in the course. And the other is the outside activity should be what educational researchers and cognitive psychologists refer to as generative activities. So generative activities are what they sound like. So activities that lead students to generate information. This could be diagram, drawing, explaining, testing. There's all, we could do the rest of the lecture just on that. So I'm going to focus on these two right here. The reason I'm going to do that, there's a couple major reviews. These two have the most substantial evidence base. So they work for the broadest range of students. They've been shown in the widest variety of settings. They promote learning beyond what's just being taught. So let's start with spacing. So spacing is all about time. So it's all about when things are presented, when it's occurring. The way to think about it is we can distinguish between mass and space practice. So mass practice means all studying occurs in one block of time. And so like if you're a student and you have your chemistry exam coming up and you say, I need to do about 4 hours, massing would be like, I do 4 hours the night before the exam. And the survey data on this shows anywhere from 67% to 100% of students agree they engage in this behavior. I think the 67% is an underestimate. Do you know what's interesting? If you learn like, anybody's familiar with social norm literature, we've done a little bit of work on this. Students report that they know all other students cram, but they don't want to cram as much. There's this weird social norm thing going on where they think that's just how college operates, that everybody crams. I would actually argue there's some things about college, I'll try to say it later, that actually encourage this behavior. A better approach is what we would call space practice. For people familiar with this literature, this is sometimes also just called distributed practice. So like same thing, psychology has a really bad time with like giving you different labels for the same content. So this would be, I'm going to study 4 hours for my chemistry exam, but I'm going to do an hour per day. So there is a huge research literature. The original work on this was actually done in the 1880s. So it's been known for a little while. There's a massive research literature basically saying all other things held equal, learning will be better with this approach and that approach. Almost what I try to tell students, if you do nothing else, if you ignore everything else I'm saying, but you space a little, you will have like gains here, you will have returns on your learning. So I'll walk you through, there's a bunch of like really carefully controlled lab studies. There's a field study I've just always liked. So I'll walk you through this one. These are high school geometry teachers at a school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This school traditionally was underperforming national averages. So what they did was this. So a traditional way math is taught, there's a really interesting analysis of middle school math textbooks that I'd be curious for your own experience. We have intense practice with, like maybe we learn Pythagorean theorem in our geometry class, and then we do a bunch of Pythagorean theorem homework, and then we move on to the next thing. That's how most, so there was one analysis showing well over 80% of all middle school textbooks are basically written in that format. That's how it's typically taught. So somehow they recognized that might be an issue. So here's what they did. They had 8 sections of geometry. They randomly assigned, I'm impressed, they randomly assigned 4 of them did their traditional practice, which was like we do Pythagorean theorem, we do your homework, and then the next day, what else do they do? Is that where they figure out how to do slope? Maybe they do. Like, yeah, maybe they do slope the next day. So they do that the next day, and they do a bunch of those problems. In the space condition, they gave them the identical homework, except they spread it out over 24 days. So everybody's doing the same problem. But in the space group, what it meant was, yeah, I learned Pythagorean theorem 2 weeks ago. I'm still having to work on Pythagorean theorem problems now, not that I just did it like that night. So that's the only, nothing else was different. Instruction was identical. Everything else was treated the same. They gave them, I've never been able to track this thing down. They gave them this standardized test at the end of the semester. I think the max score you can get on this test is 35 or 40. Here are their data. So we have our mass group and space group. So this is performance on this standardized test. Nothing else was different. The space group did better. What's interesting is the mass group performed below national average. This is the national average right here. So all they had to do, the reason I always thought this was a cool one, is all they did was like alter the homework schedule, and their school met national average. You'll often see a lot of solutions in education being fairly expensive. Like at one point, although they're suing Apple now, like the LA school system bought iPads for everybody. And by the way, there are some cool reasons for that. I like the idea that everybody has access to it. So I'm not denying that. What I am saying is there's a lot of cases where we can solve educational problems with relatively simple approaches. Yeah.
Do you have to remember how they built practice? So like after 2 days, they've covered maybe 2 topics. And so
They had fewer problems to begin with. And they would sometimes have, but it was what they wanted to do. That's why that was cool about this. They wanted to be this controlled. They wanted to make sure everybody ultimately had the same number of problems. So it did mean their problems would stack up later on. I'm going to show you, by the way, I'll put up a little graphic. I'll show you a way you could implement this in your own classes, like this kind of approach. That was a great question. So how would you do it? A couple ones. There's even, I'll give you an example. First 5 minutes of class. Just go up in front of the students and say, hey, do you remember 2 weeks ago we talked about X? What is that idea? There's actually some cool work. Somebody did this for the intro psych course, showing if you took 5 minutes at the beginning of class to review stuff, you actually got better test scores later on, just something as simple as that. And by the way, one thing I love about this, a lot of the stuff we're talking about is powerful, does not require you like destroy your entire course and try to rework everything. These are small things you can do. A couple things. The students don't always like this, but I'm a big believer in, like, why would you do this? You tell me, why would you, based on this idea, why would we do cumulative tests with students, like have a big cumulative test at the end of the semester? Why would we do that? What do you think? Yeah, so you shouldn't, like, so again, you should never get away from it. I'm into having a constant cycle of working with stuff. Gaps before exams. Okay. So you remember before I was saying, the problem we have is we're trying to jam too much content in. And so our class is like a race. So I'll give you an example. It took me years to realize I was doing this. Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, the exam's on Friday. I don't know if you've had this. I'm going to like the last minute on Wednesday and giving them content. But I'm also telling them to space their study. How can they space their study if you're giving them 1 day between? So like you can't, so to me, I was like, I'm asking them to space, but I'm not structuring the class in a way that promotes it. So here's what I did. I went through my course. I dropped content that I no longer thought was relevant. I took what I thought was one cool subtopic for every lecture that I didn't want to drop. I made that an online supplemental lecture. And I try to make them no more than 10 minutes. So very small lectures. In doing that, I divide my course into 4 equal units. For every unit, for the day before the exam, we do no new content. So it's what it's on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. The last new content is on Monday, nothing new on Wednesday, the exam's on Friday. What we do on that Wednesday, as another generative activity, I have the students do muddy point discussion posts. I don't know if you've ever done that. So like, tell me something in the class, like tell me something from the book or the lecture that you're just not catching, or I can explain a little more. On the day in between, I pull some of the muddy point posts and we just put them on PowerPoint and talk with them. Or what you'll often try this in your class, by the way, the muddy point post, if you do it, you'll see that like the students will converge on like several themes in your course that they're having trouble with. I sometimes am like, I'll try to figure out what the themes are. And then that day in between, I'll pull the themes out and we'll do like a group activity around like the thing that they're having trouble with. So we have a day in between. It gives them a chance to space. I feel much less hypocritical doing this, like telling them to space. And it also forces me to get rid of content from the course and fulfills that other goal that I don't want too much content. I'll give you one last thought. How do you talk to students about spacing? So I've always found this, I don't know if any of you like played sports or did theater or music, but I often will tell students, like, have you ever done this? But my argument to them is like, okay, so you play basketball. Did you like not practice for 2 weeks? And then the night before your game, you practice for like 5 hours and then you win? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Or even like learning is better when it's done in short bursts. So all things being equal, like I'm telling students, give me 45 minutes of high quality studying and then take a break and then come back to something else. So in the same way, like I was like, so in your, like, you played soccer or you did the flute, did you do like exactly the same exercise for 2 hours? Probably didn't. If you actually watch how sports, theater, and music are done, people work through a variety of skills. In some ways, by the way, one way to think about your own teaching is the more we can imitate how things are done, it's like high level sports or music, the better. We do things differently in education. But anyways, as you talk with students, I found that framing, like you're in a play and you did nothing, and then maybe some have reported to me they actually did math the night before their play. But that being said, like
This is not what you would do in other circumstances. Why are we comfortable doing that in your classes? All right, let me give you one more. Generative activity. This is also, earliest work on this is Gates, 1909. So this has actually been known for well over 120 years. All things being equal, it looks like asking students to remember or retrieve information leads to better retention than simply, say, rereading that information. So literature on this, like thousands of studies. I'll just walk you through one and I'll try to give you an overview. So this is Larson's at WashU, so Washington University in St. Louis. He's in the med school. The med school actually works quite closely with the psych department. There's actually, med schools are actually quite interested in learning. As a side note, being around vet schools, there's very little like literature on veterinary learning, but there's huge med school literature. I didn't realize this until I started getting into it. So these are residents in emergency pediatric medicine who are given, I know one of these has epilepsy. I actually don't know. Somebody can help me out what the other one is there. So two different lessons. Oh, thank you. So lessons are like, here, again, these are people who are going to be in the emergency room. So here are the symptoms. Here's how you diagnose. Here's how you treat. So what they did was this. They randomly assigned for one of the lessons, you read the fact sheet, and then they had you read it again. You came back a week later, they had you read it again. You came back a week later, you read it again. For the other lesson, you read it, they took it away, they gave you a blanked out version of the fact sheet, and you had to retrieve what symptoms, diagnosed, treatment was. You came back a week later, you had to retrieve symptoms, diagnosed, treatment, and then a week later, retrieve. Here's what's cool. Again, these are physicians. This is knowledge, given that they're doing emergency pediatric medicine. This is not stuff they can just go into their office and look up. They're expected to just know this kind of thing. 6 months after all that learning, in one of their other rotations, they gave them a surprise test for the content. So they have no idea this is coming. So we can also see how much doctors remember from their training. So the repeated study group are remembering about a quarter, the repeated testing group, and this is a consistent finding. Testing effects tend to, everything I'm talking about here, but I talk with students about this. If you did no study, you probably should cram the night before. I have nothing else to offer you. But if your goal is you want some kind of long-term retention, I want to be able to call on this information, these are the techniques that are going to promote that kind of thing. So there's a huge literature. Chulin Yang at Beijing Normal University actually has a pretty cool meta-analysis. They looked at hundreds of studies, tens of thousands of students across 18 different academic domains. And what they looked at is they compared classes that either did no quizzing versus some quizzing, or very little quizzing versus a lot of quizzing. They essentially find quizzing raised academic, regular quizzing raises academic performance by anywhere from like half to a third of a letter grade. That's for people who are into meta-analysis and effect sizes. G is the same as D. It's just often what's used in meta-analysis to account for a little bias in D. So these effects are powerful. And what's interesting too, they also show a concern I often get is like, okay, I'll quiz them. Aren't they just going to know the stuff they quiz on? They also show gains well beyond the specifically tested information. So it's a huge literature. So what ends up being, we have a course that Ed DeLosh and Cleary and I created called Science of Learning. Our running joke in that course, we really do go through a lot of stuff, but then we could reduce the course to 3 words, space and test. So this ends up, in terms of how you think about structuring your course, the first thing I always look for is what degree are you spacing, and what degree are you asking for generative activities? Quizzing would be one. Here's how you might do it. And that's why I really like that question about quizzes earlier. Here's a tradition, even for folks doing quizzes, here's a traditional way people might set it up. So we had chapter 1, I'll give you the chapter 1 questions, chapter 2, and so forth. Here's how you would do it by spacing. So yeah, we do like a full set of chapter 1 questions, but second week we throw in some chapter 1 and chapter 2, and I won't keep saying it, you can see this in front of you. So in my class, what I try to do for one of them, they have a 10-question quiz. I use what's called a mastery format developed by Ed DeLosh. They can take it as many times as they want. I do it until they get the grade they want. Ed's the pure version of this until they get a perfect grade. We do have some evidence and some other work showing that kind of format better promotes learning than traditional quizzing. So we do that. So what I do is they get 6 to 7 questions on the most recent content, and then I put in what I might call wildcard questions.
They have 3 to 4 questions that could reflect content from any point in the course at any time. And so they can never get away from any content. They're constantly working with it. This is just one instantiation, but this looks to be among the most effective ways to do it based on some of the research literature. Okay, I actually have one short myth left, and that's actually all I have for you. So I'm really interested in this right here. There's actually there was this really cool Australian researcher, Trickwell, and some Finnish researchers who did a lot of work on people's attitudes and approach to teaching. It's actually teaching scales there. And it looks like there are differences. Some of these align to so-called hard sciences versus liberal arts, social sciences, but the alignment's not quite that neat. But there are 2 things going on here. There's a large number of instructors who see the goal of being an instructor as what's sometimes referred to as information transmission. So the goal of class is I come to class, I know this stuff, I tell you the things you should know, you write that down, and then you come back to class at some point and take a test, and we'll see how well you know it. And there's some indication that this framework maybe has sort of a gatekeeper feel to it. Like there's a certain amount of stuff you need to know if you want to get out of here. Another approach, people do differ, is a student-centered approach, where the idea is like the class is centered around you. I want you to like construct material and work with the material, and I want to support you throughout. And so my argument is, so again, think about this as being like there's sort of a gatekeeper vibe or like a nurturing vibe here. You don't have to think about that as a dichotomy. So instead, like for folks who know the student affairs and higher education literature, I don't know if you've read, I love this model right here. It's referred to as the challenge support model. So this model suggests, part of the model is like figuring out where students are at, and challenging them for what they can handle, supporting them and others, but translated to the classroom. So I said one of my teaching philosophies is thinking about how you structure learning environments. My other one that we all talk about is high expectations, high support. So my argument to you is, you're allowed to have high standards and be nice to the students. Like you can, so I'm a big believer, like you can set high standards, just be clear about your expectations and how people can meet those expectations and provide the supports for it. So I don't think we have to see those things as different. I think we can demand the best from our students, be transparent about that, and then support them in terms of achieving that. That's just my sort of take on it. Actually, almost all I have. There's a bunch of other myths that I could go on. I'll give you a few if you're curious. We as the instructor are really good at understanding other people's language. It turns out to not really be the case. There's something, I've ever run into, it's sometimes called the curse of knowledge or the curse of expertise. So you're usually teaching your class because you are an expert in that area, but by virtue of being an expert in that area, it's actually very difficult for you to understand where students are coming from. So there's a really interesting literature on that. Has anybody run into this, that you're condemning your students to never learning anything if you let them take their notes on laptops? I actually still see this in people's syllabi. That turned out, there was one finding that came out that suggested that all the follow-ups did not replicate that finding. So this is not a thing, it's okay. But I still see this showing, I basically still see people's syllabi saying you shouldn't take notes on laptops because it's learning. There's no evidence for that. I'll give you another one. What I mean by this is, if a student, we've gone over content in class today, if the student can say it back to me, they've learned it. They probably haven't. So one way to think about it, there's a distinction between what's called learning and performance. Performance is, can you access the information now? Learning is, have you had a durable change in knowledge? So if you remember I said that exit ticket thing, instead of doing an exit ticket for today, do an exit ticket for 2 weeks ago, that's going to be much more diagnostic of learning. An exit ticket for today, students could do well, but they're really just showing what we would call performance. They can recall it. So just because somebody can say it back to you now doesn't mean. And my last one would be that college instructors don't need training. I actually think we have. I'm still learning at this point. So this is all I have for you today. Thanks so much for your time. I'd love to have discussion. And what would you? Yeah.
So that folks can hear So
Absolutely.
say it as clearly as you can, and then we'll see.
I'll yell it into the L. Okay, well, that's. Oh, yeah. This is a really good question. So on Teams, the question is like, I hear where you're coming from on tyranny of content, but a lot of people are like, my department, the curriculum is set. I have to go through this content, or I feel like I really must go through this. How do you respond to people have that? And that's so again, working with the vet school, I think I said like when I talked about that, I literally had everybody in the room put their hands up. And then to be honest, they all started talking with each other and debating what was important versus not important to the point. I'm not actually being glib. I almost was like, I actually think I should just walk out of the room and like let you all talk right here. So, but what's interesting there, they had never talked about that as a group, and they had all made assumptions about what should be going in and what shouldn't be going in. So it sounds like a first part is having a department that would be receptive to talking about what's in our curriculum, what's mandatory, where you have discretion. In the Department of Psychology, we have some things we need to hit to make sure we hit our learning goals. We have quite a bit of freedom in terms of the specific content we need to put in there. So my best thing is, there's a couple of things. It sounds first like you would actually need to get some buy-in that we're probably not doing like our best by students if we're trying to put as much content in as possible. The second, if we have that buy-in, can we discuss what would be effective for learning and what that curriculum would look like? I understand the vet folks who were like, I get what you're saying, and a lot of the stuff we're talking about is not important. We're just stuck on this licensing exam. But beyond things like that, how many departments are really stuck? I guess the question would be, are we doing it because that's always the way we've done it? Versus, no, there's some real constraints and we have to make sure. The other thing too is, are you saying every single thing is absolutely essential? There's nothing that you can be pulling out to let the class breathe. But no, what you're really getting at is to do that well in some places requires sometimes buy-in beyond the instructor. I don't know if that's how you would see it, but that's how I would see it. So these are, unfortunately, a lot of these are like above my pay grade, if that makes any sense. But yeah, no, I totally resonate. And I've actually, that's the number, whenever I bring this up, the number one thing I get is people saying, I have no choice. Yeah. Do every night or every Sunday night at midnight. You can do them anytime you want. And I have a couple other things going on. I have a set of, I have a set of what I call study questions that go along with the course. That's a whole other, I think we should be giving students actual study guides. The data suggests students are not particularly good at writing their own questions. The quiz questions all come from that. And so I'm like, do your study guide. It's a completely open book, open note. They can take it as many times as you want. We have data showing that they do better. Here's the way I do it though. For every unit, for every quiz, I have 25 to 40 quiz questions. I put a huge amount of work in. Because one thing you're wondering is, if you let them keep taking again, aren't they just going to start memorizing the answers? So yeah, so what it does is each time it randomly draws 10 questions from my set and then randomly assigns its place. And then it's literally a button you click on in Canvas that lets you have them take it as many times as they want until they're done. But so yeah, it took a big investment up front. In fact, I worked with somebody else. We pool our quiz questions. So again, I don't know about you, anytime I implement something, I'm saying this even with the student, the first thing I think about is how could students game the system? So my goal is always I'm sure they could game it, but I try to almost make it so it's actually going to be easier to answer the questions, honestly, than it would be to like take a picture of every question that comes up or something. Yeah.
We have a question online.
Oh, yes, please.
A faculty member says, can you elaborate what you mean by generative activities outside of class?
Oh, generative. So what are we doing to get students, what it sounds like, to generate information related to the course? So a couple examples. So the quizzing we've been talking to would be generative. Do you remember I said something about, so I'm like, it's like an answer to you, but I'm actually answering online. So I'll look at the how. So another one would be, remember I talked about muddy point discussion posts, tell me something you're not understanding. I love doing written assignments with my class, so I like to have short written assignments that are often, we've talked about concept X in class. Can you talk about that? Like, I'll give an example. We're about to do theories of expertise. Their written assignment is going to be, tell me about something you became skilled at in your life, and then talk about it in terms of the theory of expertise we talked about. There's a bunch more. Fiorella is a great person. Fiorella, for example, has a paper where they go through 8 major generative techniques. I'd be happy to distribute that paper. But anything that gets students active working with information would qualify as a generative technique. In fact, people have actually criticized it for the very reason I just said there, that it's almost too broad, but I think it's a good rule of thumb in the classroom.
Okay.
Sure.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Oh, so the quizzes are automated. So Canvas is doing that for me. I'm looking at Fabian, right? But like, I almost have a problem with grading in the sense that like, I can't stand having anything ungraded. So I have a 60-person class. I'm doing almost all the discussion posts. I do have a cadre of really excellent undergraduate TAs who team up with me. I like to do some in-class activities. They help me score the in-class activities. But yeah, I like do nothing.
Well, folks, I'm going to call it right there. We can stick around for a few minutes. I know that Professor Rhodes has to scoot out.